Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Pastor T and I will be reflecting today on Unit 1, Lesson 4, Life in the Spirit. The scripture text for this lesson is from Galatians 5, verses 22 through 26, the fruits of the Spirit. I'm Rachelle Lyndaker Schlabach. I'm one of the co-pastors at Millersburg Mennonite Church in Millersburg, Ohio.
And I am Pastor T, Pastor of Outreach at Oxford Circle Mennonite Church in Philadelphia.
Great to be with you again, Pastor T.
Same here.
So I think one of the challenges for today's lesson is that it is such a familiar scripture passage that has both good and bad to it, right? It's a wonderful thing that many in your class probably are familiar with this text. Maybe some of them could recite the fruits of the Spirit by heart. And that's great that it's a much loved text for many, but it's also a challenge to know how to teach a lesson like that sometimes. How do you put a fresh spin on it and keep people's attention and help them dive deeper into it? One thing that comes to mind is particularly if your class includes some newer Christians, it would be helpful to hear their perspectives, especially perhaps people who don't have a church background. How do they understand words like love, joy, peace? What does it mean for them? And especially invite their input into the conversation. If you don't have people who are from other faith backgrounds or newer Christians who could share, another option is to spend some time with that chart, which is on page 23 of the participant guide on being and doing, which is really kind of a way to force people to define some of these really familiar terms. And that could be an opportunity to help people really think about these common words that we toss around. What do they really mean? Do they like the definition that's there? Would they like to expand on it? That would be one option for you as the teacher.
These are good examples that you give here, Rachelle. As I think about the same passage, I appreciate you talking about how, like, even though these are universal virtues, we still might not all have the same exact definitions. We do probably have a common starting point, but it's important to think about it because as the scripture says about, even early in the passage, talks about the old ways. That's what Paul talks about. So there's this sense that these fruits of the Spirit are supposed to be something new. And one of the things that makes them new is not that they're foreign to people, it's that the source that's providing them is new. Maybe new to new Christians, or maybe a new idea to new believers. And the other aspect of it too is that normally you see these universal virtues express themselves within familial bonds or biological family. And what Paul is calling the Galatians to is to express it with people who you are not biologically related to. And that's an extremely new concept for them. And even today, even though the world is modern now and we are open to these ideas, it still takes work to do that with people who are not like us. So even though we're familiar with these virtues, expressing them consistently with people who may come from a different income background, different ethnicity, culture, language, you name it, takes the indwelling of the Spirit to make sure that we understand that it is not us ourselves that is doing this. This is God doing something in us. And it is that becomes something that people see, and that becomes our way of expressing community.
Yeah, as you were describing that, it reminded me of how that different way of being, especially beyond biological bonds, was something that set apart the early Christians and made people really say, whoa, what is it about this Jesus movement that's going on? And how can we continue to live our lives that way today? Yeah, I think as we look at the fruits of the Spirit, often we think about it in terms of how I am expressing these characteristics. How am I being loving or joyful or whatever? And a way of turning that around perhaps is to think of opportunities where your class members could name where they have received those gifts of the Spirit from others. How have they experienced others expressing faithfulness or peace or whatever the case may be? Or perhaps a more challenging way to dive into it too is to encourage people to think about, out of this list, which one do they think is least evident in their life? Which one do they want to work on the most? That might be something that's hard, depending on class size and familiarity and comfort levels, to talk about in the full classroom, but you might want to invite people to pair up and share with the person beside them, as they reflect on the list, what is something that they feel called to work on in their own lives.
Rachel, you said that very well. So I don't have a whole lot to add to that other than as they are asking those questions, I would also ask, where do you see these virtues expressed in society, and which ones do you see not expressed as much? Because there are times when, because of the lack of virtue in some areas, we may have been hurt or harmed in some kind of way. And it could be because there's a particular areas of society where a particular fruit of the spirit is not valued, and so in that way too, that becomes that can easily become a beacon for non-believers to see how the Christian community lives by these fruits and expresses them. And I really believe that they're attractive to people. And the reason why I believe they're attractive is because there's a sense of accountability with them. There's a sense that we have to count others higher than ourselves, which means we're not just always asking, what can I get out of this? We're asking, how can I give of myself, even when it's difficult? And that should be a mark of the Christian community. So we need to continue to ask the questions of where these areas are also lacking in society, because that gives us the opportunity to also to shine light.
Yeah, absolutely. The fruits of the Spirit don't just impact our internal church community, but they very much should be impacting the world around us. And as the lesson goes on, the Transform section touches on that. How are these fruits of the Spirit impacting the world? But one thing that comes to mind as I think about that is the honest question of how are we doing as the church in reflecting the fruits of the Spirit? I came across a study, maybe some of you are familiar with, the Jesus in America research study that the Episcopal Church released back in March. And one of the findings was about the characteristics that respondents associate with Christians. Now, Christian respondents chose words like giving and compassionate and loving and respectful. Sounds like the fruits of the Spirit, right? It sounds like those of us in the church think this is what characterizes us as Christians. But the part that's hard to hear is that non-Christians who responded to the survey associated most with the words that they associated most with Christians were hypocritical, judgmental, self-righteous, and arrogant, which, if you think about it, is pretty much the exact opposite of the fruits of the Spirit. It's humbling to hear about how others think about us in the church. And the first reaction, if you raise that with your class, might be some defensiveness. But I'd encourage you to consider pushing that out a little bit. Why is it that that's how people experience us in the church? Are we willing to hear that? Are we willing to take a humble enough stance to hear that that is how many people experience the church? And how can we address that? How can we be that winsome, attractive presence in the world around us that I hear you talking about, Pastor T, and which I also firmly believe we as the church can be? So how can we more fully live out Jesus' mission and plan for the world?
Yeah, and this is something that as the church has grown and is worldwide, that we have to grapple with these perceptions. And it's in addition to the questions that you're asking, which are good questions, is we need to also ask it in a very local context of where we're at. Because what happens is that when we start asking it within our church, and then we start to ask it within those around our church, and then we radiate out, we begin to see how the church has had impact in the areas where the church hasn't had any impact. And we get to see whether the impact has been positive or negative. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are, when we're called to this community, it's not a private community. It's a public community that we're a part of. And I think that's something that we need to remember, not public in the sense of like a public administration or in terms of city, but that we're living our faith out loud. We're living it out so that it's transparent so that others can see it. And which means we do have to grapple with when we express it in ways that are not Christ-like. And we have to be humble enough to own that and to, in many cases, ask for forgiveness. So in that sense, the fruits of the Spirit are like almost cyclical. Like if we're moving away from it, it can pull us right back as we focus on Christ and what the Spirit is doing. And I've seen that in my time of ministry over the years. I've seen that actually disarm people because they are expecting sometimes a defensiveness. So it's important that in your class that you have these discussions, because you still have to, you will run up against perceptions of Christians that where we have more work that we need to do. So that concludes our time here with this lesson. We will let you know that concludes it for the month of June, and it concludes it for this unit. We thank you for allowing us to share with you, Rachelle and I, and blessings to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.